don't really know if I'm doing the right thing writing this. I kind of feel like there's not a lot out there which really tells the story in its fullest sense. It's all about the day, it's all about the day of the massacre, but I just think there's a lot more that needs to be said about it. You don't do this to a place on a whim. There's a lot more to be said about the resistance in the area and the fact that this didn't really have anything to do with the resistance. When the Germans came, anyone who had anything to do with the resistance fled. You wouldn't stick around, you'd hide. People who were hiding here because it was a calm place, it was a place to come to be away from the war. I'm coming around to that now.
For our tour today, we're going to look mainly at the main village itself. This is the main bourg, and you can see that we're going to start looking at the upper village, the western edge. This is where, as a visitor, you used to come in into the village if you came to see the place. And just looking up the road back at the old entrance, you can see the tram tracks on the right hand side, and there is the Centre de la Mémoire, the new one, just in the distance, which now brings you up into the centre of the village, really, a little bit further on than those buildings there. This is the cabin, still standing, where you used to buy your brochures and postcards and things. And we're going to start off in this area because I think it's a really kind of evocative view as you walk towards the centre of the village, and a lot of the burn marks are still there on the buildings themselves. This building is what was François Dupic's textile shop. There were two Dupic brothers, and this building was actually used by the SS as one of the two kind of headquarters during the operation on the 10th of June, and it was one of the last to be burnt down the following morning. Some people came into Oradour and saw it still standing on the morning of the 11th. Next door to that is the Dagouri residence, which was known as the Café de la Promenade. Melanie Dagouri took over her husband's cement business and also ran a cafe with members of her family. One of her daughters also had a dressmaking shop on the same premises. It was a really kind of important place for Oradour. It had a room above it as well, which was used for social occasions. There you can see it back at the time with its cows pulling the traction, and you've got Melanie Dagouri there with one of her sons. The room above the property was used by the Avenir Musicale d'Oradour-sur-Glane, which was the local musicians association, and they used it for their dances, they used it for their practice, and also Monsieur Tournier used it to provide music lessons for the children of Oradour. There are several really interesting buildings at this part of the village, because you can see there the pylons which carry the electricity coming into the village, and as you can see the tram lines there. This is the post office, and you can still see that. You can still see the lettering on the front of the building itself. It's a beautiful building, and it was built. I can't remember the exact date, but around the time that the train station was built, which was around the sort of 1911 mark. You can still see the lettering there, Post Telegraph, the PTT lettering. There is a panel which commemorates Odette Bouillet, who was the postmistress on the day that the Germans came, and she actually had her nephew staying with her on that day upstairs with her mother, and a 10-year-old nephew unfortunately was caught up in the massacre and didn't survive. As we make our way into the centre of the village, we'll pass on in a minute the tram stop on the left hand side, but before we even get to that, on the right hand side you'll see kind of a bourgeois house, I suppose, which belonged to Paul Desorteaux, who was mayor of the village at the time of the massacre. In fact, he was the head of the special delegation. He never really won his seat as mayor, but his family came from a long line of mayors of the past, and you can see him in this photo. Quite a distinguished man, a family of doctors, but he had 5 sons, and most of them are in this photograph. Dr. Desorteaux's home is just opposite the actual two tram stops. One was for merchandise. You can't quite see it in this video. It's a little bit further back next to the post office. And one is the main tram stop. And the station master was André Brandy, who was the middle daughter, I think, of the Brandy sisters, who will come to see in the middle of the village, who ran a cafe. So every day a few trams would stop here, taking people to and from Limoges. It was a real boon to the village to have this tram installed in 1911. It really did kind of transform the local economy, and villages along this line really benefited from the people that came to the village particularly on weekends, but at other times too. Also, people were able to travel into the city to sell their wares. A little further on, just after the railway, we've got a building that was built partly as the school for boys and partly as the mairie, the town hall. Interestingly, the head teacher of the boys' school also had to serve as the secretary to the mayor. And that was Leonard Rousseau. He and his wife each had a class of boys in their boys' school, and there was due to be a new school built opposite in the field behind the tram stop when the massacre happened, and it was a project that was ongoing for quite a while, and it never happened, tragically. You can see here, just opposite the school, one of the few water pumps in the village, which, along with the well in the Champ de Foire, served the village with water. There was no running water in the properties. On the other side of the road is there the other Dupic shop, which sold its wares, and during the days of the fair would put out all of its merchandise into the street. You can see on that building particularly the scorch marks from the fires. Robert Ebras's mother used to sew for the Dupic brothers and sell pillowcases, duvets, that kind of thing, on to be sold by the Dupics. This property, the Hotel Avril, had lots of guests during the occupation. Lots of people came to stay in these hotels because they had nowhere else to go, but a lot of people came also to flee the occupation of the country. And Madame Avril herself had a daughter who came and lived with her at the hotel to help her run it. Madame Avril is there on the right hand side with a son-in-law to help her run the Hotel Avril. Living nearby was the Pined family, a Jewish family that had come from Bayonne. Robert Pined and his mother there, and wife on the left hand side, and daughters Jacqueline and Francine and son André, who on the day of the massacre hid underneath these concrete steps and miraculously were let go by a soldier who found them and allowed them to go free. Robert Pined was clever in that he had worked for one of the Jewish aid organisations in Bayonne, and he continued to do so without the knowledge of his family. And he told them to hide when, and he was able to do so because he'd rented them a property across the street from where he and his wife were sleeping. After the massacre, his family found documents in the ruins of the house, including this prescription written by Dr. Desorto to one of the family, which bears the doctor's address there at the top. Obviously, being Jewish, the family had to have Jewish stamps on their documents. Living next door to the Pined family were the Rumi family. Jean Rumi had been the head of the Legion, something of a Pétainiste, and there were those who believed that he and his son Albert were involved some way after the event. Actually, that's complete nonsense. They both died, unfortunately, in the massacre. Jean sold products for agriculture, grain and fertilizers and that kind of thing, and Albert signed up for the Organisation Toute on the western coast, which made, for some people who saw him in his uniform once or twice, thought he was a milicien, which was in fact not the case at all. You can see in this photo he's engaged to Jeanette Couturier, and actually that weekend it was their engagement party, and they had turned up on a tandem that Jeanette's father had bought for them just a day or two earlier. They were celebrating with family and friends. Now let's look at this part of the village, which comes from Saint-Junien, this road coming up from Saint-Junien that kind of comes into a junction in the road, and then just almost opposite that you've got the Champ de Foire. So we'll look at both places and see where the people were gathered. This is kind of the point at which you join the village these days if you go there via the Centre de la Mémoire. And once you go through the exhibition, you come into these two corridors. In fact, it's one corridor. On two sides of it, you've got two long walls of faces. And yeah, for me, it's really transformed the experience of going to Oradour, having this initial kind of blast of people and the names of these families. You can see there are still quite a few gaps. Back in 2014, the Centre de la Mémoire tried to put together as many photographs, as many faces to names as they possibly could for a temporary exhibition, and then obviously moving it into this. And I think it's a really positive way to start the visit. So we're going to go to the Picard farm in a minute. Maurice Picard was what they call a régisseur, so he organised for farmers to kind of rent farms, tenant farmers. We're kind of on this corner, like I said, this junction. This is where the Valentin property kind of is right on the corner of these two roads, and just next door to that you'll see the town's bascule, the weighing scales, which is where on fair days the produce that came into the village and other times as well would be weighed. And you can see the family here, the Titi Valentin and Jean Valentin stood with family members actually on the bascule, which is still there. This is the Valentin couple, and Robert Pike told me about going and scrumping those apples in his garden. He was a barber, I suppose a hairdresser, as well as other things, and Titi's main job was to operate the bascule. This is the view of that kind of junction just after the massacre took place, and you can see there the wine merchant's car with the bicycle on top of it. That's actually a car that ended up being known as the Risotto doctor's car, was moved on to the Champ de Foire. So looking back up that little road from Saint-Junien, where you get to that junction, on the right hand side you've got the Picard farm. The Farm de Loz, as it was known, and at one point Marguerite Roufanche, who was the one woman to escape the massacre out of the church, actually their family kind of were tenants in this farm. By the time of the massacre it was being run by various local and Alsace workers, and also a couple some friends from Roubaix who had been evacuated. It was being run generally by evacuees and refugees, and you can see it had its own bascule. It's also here that there's a pit where bodies were found after the event. Several bodies. I don't think they were ever identified here. That's the well, and that's Roger Godefroy, the little boy who survived, in front of the well. Just around the corner from that is the Denis wine cellar warehouse, I guess, which was where one of the groups were sent to be shot. The groups of men and boys over the age of 16. So we're getting now to the Champ de Foire, where the population was gathered by the SS. You can see there, we'll come back to it in a second, the pharmacy, which belonged to a young pharmacist called Marcel Pascal, and it was in front of that pharmacy that the population were gathered. That's Marcel Pascal there. Some claimed he might have had some links to the resistance. I've got nothing confirmed on that whatsoever. You can see the devastation to that building straight after the event. But similarly, you can see in this photo taken when there was a GTE camp for Spanish refugees, the Champ de Foire in all its kind of formal glory. If you know anything about the Oradour story, you probably will know something about the roundup and the fact that the population were then split up and women and children taken to the church, while the men were put into 6 groups.
I do sometimes wonder why people come here. Why am I so interested in it? This is where they're all gathered.
It must have been such a long wait, kind of separated from the rest of your family and not knowing what was going to happen, but everything was done fairly calmly, and it was an early summer's day. While they were waiting, the pâtissier, Monsieur Compin, this is his shop, came out and asked whether he could go and check on his cakes, and was told no, the cakes would be looked after. No one really knew what was going to happen next.
Definitely think today it's going to be a bit of a shift in what I write. I'm not going to be trying to link the resistance anymore. I don't think so anyway. It's very sensitive. I need to respect that. Behind me you can see the cemetery.
We'll come back to the cemetery a little later, and actually you can see how close it is to the Champ de Foire. That was actually the escape route for a lot of the men, and the people that got away provided a hiding place for one man who hid in a sort of semi-constructed grave, and it was the way into the woods to go beyond Oradour. This is the Café Épicerie, so it's a grocery cum cafe which belonged to Émile Redon. And he actually survived. He had been in Limoges that day. He was on the tram that came back later that evening, and yeah, he was a bit of an entrepreneur. Sold sand that he dredged from the river. He pressed apples with a mechanical press that he installed. Yeah, it was a really sort of one of the central kind of businesses on the Champ de Foire. Also on the Champ de Foire was the well, which was still working at that time. Some of Oradour's kind of larger properties were also just off the Champ de Foire, including places like the Sinon farm, which again most of the farms were owned by one or two families, but rented out. Actually, that particular building, it's just next door to it, but it was around this area that the six men, including Robert Pike, Jean-Marcel Dartout, Clément Bressoudier, Yvan Auby, they escaped from the Lodi barn, which is part of one of the buildings, one of the farm buildings, just off the Champ de Foire. The Lodi Mounier barn, kind of named after the families that owned that particular farm, was known locally as Le Grand Blanc. I think it was just a barn that was whitewashed. It's across this ground that those men escaped, but you can see where the Lodi Monnier barn was, and the men had to kind of move along this area when they were escaping the fire as it spread. We'll go a little bit closer here to the Lodi barn, and you can see here lieu de supplice, which means that that's where people were unfortunately killed, and it does mark there as well that 6 men escaped, including, of course, Robert Pike. The Lodi barn was one of 6 places of execution, as well as the church, and it's sort of the road to the cemetery kind of goes past it. You can see there from the main street, the main rue Émile des Hortos. So that Lodi barn backed onto the main street, which was one of the reasons why the men had to kind of escape through the sort of grass of the Champ de Foire. Very little of it remains now. It's very much grown over. You can see a lot more from the sort of older photographs of these places. We'll move now to the sort of central part of the village, where you've got most of your shops and also the church, the lower Champ de Foire as well, which is the sort of the church square. Just you can see there the cemetery road, and now we're on the main recognisable street with its tram lines. This rather haunting photograph is known to be one of the last photographs of that main street, which was taken before the massacre in 1944. I don't know if any sort of better versions of it exist. It makes it look very, very old, but in fact, yeah, I was told it was one of the last of that stretch, taken of that stretch up to the Champ de Foire. And you can see on the next image that, you know, it's not exactly the same angle, but you can see how it looked almost immediately afterwards. Utter devastation. This is one of the village's bakeries, the Bouchot bakery, and it was in this particular bakery where Armand Sinon, who survived the massacre, having watched almost the whole thing happen from his window at the Sinon farm overlooking the Champ de Foire. He'd broken his leg and was laid up in bed. But he watched the whole thing almost happen. You can read about that in the book, and you can see there, that's the ovens at the back where 2 bodies were found subsequent to the massacre. I'm pretty sure that those bodies were put there on the following day, when several bodies were in the street and had to be kind of disposed of, as was probably the case with the bodies in the well. And sadly, those, I think, were probably the bodies of children. One of the real characters of Oradour was Pierre Putereau, who owned a garage in the centre of town, and he had 7 children actually, and only one of those children, young Simone, who'd been sent away to live with grandparents, because, well, I'm not quite sure, but I think it was just because there were so many mouths to feed. So she survived, but lost both her parents as well as 6 brothers and sisters. Devastating, really. And this is his garage on the main Rue Émile des Hortons. He was actually the 7th man to escape from the Lodi barn, but tragically, on his way to the cemetery, he was spotted and shot by an SS sentry, and his spot is now marked where his body was found, wrapped in barbed wire. Really kind of a tragic story. The young man kneeling in the centre of this picture is André des Hortons, whose one grandfather was Paul des Hortons, who we saw earlier, the head of the special delegation, or the mayor in all but name, at the time of the massacre. His other grandfather was Joseph Beau, and Joseph Beau was his mother's father. Now, the couple got involved in an affair, and the two men, Monsieur Beau and Monsieur Desorto, the two mayors, were real political rivals. They didn't like each other much. So this was a little bit of a Romeo and Juliet thing, and the Desorto, or Émile Desorto, André's father, was almost exiled to Limoges for some time. That is, until Joseph Beau decided that he wanted his grocery store, because he was a socialist, and he was an artisan, I guess, in terms of his class. Asked his daughter and Émile Desorto to come back to Oradour, just at the time when André, who was there on the right-hand side, his daughter was due to be born, and they took over the Desorto épicerie, grocery store, on the main street, and it was a very successful business. It was already established by Joseph Beau, who continued to sort of live with the family. And André Desorto had a very interesting upbringing. He knows everything. He still knows everything about Oradour, having been a young boy in the grocery store, listening to his mother talk to all the various customers. There he is in that photograph at the very front. I don't know if you recognise him from the other photographs there. And next door to the épicerie was the École de Filles, so the girls' school. So André used to enjoy, as a little boy, looking over the window into the playground of the girls' school, and used to watch them for long periods of time. This is one of the most heartbreaking places, I suppose, in Oradour. All the schools are. You can see in that photograph there's lots of people or young girls whose stories I've researched and tell in my book. One of them, there's several Spanish girls, but one of them is this Spanish girl called Nuria, who came from Barcelona in 1938, and then there's Marguerite Simon, who came from Paris, who was sent from Paris for safety, very bright young girl. And of course you can't forget the teachers. This is, on the right hand side, she has Denise Bardet with her brother and her mother, whose birthday, his 24th birthday it was, on the 10th of June 1944. And then also Odette Couty, who was a replacement teacher. People knew very little about her, but in fact she'd already worked in a school for Jewish refugees, and she was due to finish her post the day before the 10th, but had agreed to work an extra day. This is one of the butcher shops owned by Gabriel Mer, who was a refugee. There were two waves of refugees, one from Schiltigheim, just outside Alsace-Lorraine, and they went back in 1940. They were evacuated because of the war in Alsace-Lorraine, and then Alsace-Lorraine, that was sort of annexed, and you had a second lot of refugees from Moselle a little bit later. Gabriel Mer, one of the few refugees that kind of really set up a business in Oradour, which succeeded. Returning to the Desorto family, the second from the left there, Jacques Desorto, was a little bit unlike some of his other brothers who become doctors, like Paul Desorto and their grandfather, and so he became a mechanic, and he had his own garage in town. And one interesting thing about his garage is that he survived the ordeal, along with several other people who he kind of by chance happened to be in the garage with him when the soldiers arrived, and they hid firstly behind the garage, and then he and his brother, one of his brothers, Emile, not Emile, sorry, one of his other brothers, went into the garage itself. His brother was discovered, but he pretty much watched the whole thing through some cracks in the wall, and they were incredibly close, next door to one of the spots of execution, and it's pretty miraculous, really, given how close they were, that they managed to hide and escape the fire and get through the night. And so we're at the bottom now of the Rue Émile des Orteaux. You can just see the lieu de supplice there, the execution place next to the des Orteaux garage, and we'll move into the church square. Before we get there, just on the other side of the Rue Émile des Orteaux, there's the sabotier, Monsieur Desglin, the clog maker, and you used to go there and get your clogs made before taking them off to the blacksmiths to be hobnailed. And sabots, or these clogs, were really what all the children wear, and some adults as well. So that's that view back up Rue Émile des Orteaux, which shows you the tram lines on the right hand side. You can see there the Villat. I guess it's a bureau de tabac these days. It's a buraliste. You can see the steps leading up to that property, and Monsieur Villat, his daughter and their new baby grandson was with them on the day of the tragedy. Just on the other side of that lane going off is the Besson textile shop, which was the other textile shop in town. And you can see on this photograph the Villa de Buraliste, and you can see there on the right a bar called the Estaminet Thomas. Estaminet is another word for bar in French, and it was kind of between two boulangeries, so it was kind of in a really good place for people to stop and have a drink as they came to get their bread. You were never really stuck for somewhere to get a drink in this village. This part of town, particularly around the church and the Chien de la Liberté there, the freedom tree. That's what we can see in front of us there is the Café de la Chaîne, run by the Molièras couple, Lucien and his wife, and their daughter. And it was not just a cafe, but also a coiffure, a barber's shop. It was where Lucien Molièras had employed Joseph Bergman, who was a German, actually. A lot of people believed him to be Austrian, but he was a German. And he worked there and was a popular member of staff. Also, you had the hat shop element of the business as well, because Madame Molièras was originally a hat maker, and so she continued that element of her life as well, and it meant that as with many businesses in Oradour at this time, you had different branches of a family business in one place. The Café de la Chaîne, or the Café Molièras, tended to be more popular with some of the older members of the community. You could play billiards there, play cards there, and eventually the daughter Irene sort of took over looking after the cafe along with her parents. She never really wanted to move away from her parents, and the cafe was next door to Les Halles, which was the indoor market area, and on market days, or the fair days really, you should say really, it was a really popular cafe, obviously, next door to that. And you can just about see it on this picture outside the church, in the church square, during one of the religious festival days. Okay, let's look at the lower village now, and we'll start at that little road going out to the north towards the village of Les Bordes, and it's Rue we'll take in also then the church and a little bit of the lower village that leads down to the River Glane, which you can see there on the eastern edge of the village. Along this road we had one of the wheelwrights, the Lesparra family. This is Fernand Lesparra, and that's quite a rare image inside one of the buildings in Oradour. It's his workshop. So along that area, he used to work with his father, and the family history is quite interesting. His first cousin was someone called Albert Mirablant, who was an American. His mother had gone off to live in America, and he was involved in certain aspects of the resistance, and happened to be killed in the massacre when he was just passing through the village on his bicycle to go and see his mother. There's rumours that he was actually involved in some sort of resistance activity, probably in Saint-Junien on that day. Also along the same lane, the Route des Bordes, we've also got the primary school, which also had built just behind it a kind of a temporary structure, which was the school for the refugees from, well, first Schiltigheim and then Moselle, really. That's when it was built a little bit later on in the occupation. What happened was you had two waves of the refugees, but the ones who came in sort of November 1940, they knew they couldn't go back, so something had to be done, to give them an education while they were in Oradour. So this school was built. This is the Godefroy family, and one of those children survived. He was the only child who did survive, Roger, but his other sisters there in that photo unfortunately were killed. Roger had been told to run if he ever saw any Germans, because coming from Alsace-Lorraine, this family felt persecuted by the Germans for quite a long time. His sisters, though, followed the rest of the children up to the Champ de Foire, and that was the last time that Roger saw them. So this is as far as you can go along that road at the moment, but you can see this is the first site that some people who came in from Les Bordes on the morning of the 11th had. That was the view coming down in the other direction towards you can see the Café du Chêne in the background there, that you would have coming from the village of Les Bordes. You can see there the wagon wheel, if you like, outside the wheelwright's property, the Lesparra property, where father and son have been making wheels for many years. On the other side of that road, we had, by 1944, a women's hairdresser run by Janine Reynaud, as she was there. It was a family kind of property, this, because Janine was one of three sisters. Their father had died, Amand, family named Brandy, and their cafe, the Café Central or Café Brandy, is kind of on the corner. This is opposite the Café Molièras, and it was kind of a younger person's cafe, really, run by, as I said, the three sisters. A couple of other businesses down in that little dip there, where the lower village kind of is kind of centralised, and one of which is Marcel Machefel's Cobblers, as well as the Hôtel Milor, and one or two other sort of bars and things, and a grocery store. So yeah, this is the three sisters. We've got Janine, and we've got André, and we've got Antoinette Brandy. And André actually fell in love with one of the Spanish refugees who had been in the GTE camp. Milan Bielsa. Onto the church, which is just opposite the Café Central. You can see how it was before the tragedy. Beautiful church, the Église Saint-Martin. You can see here Jacques Loriche, who was one of the sort of pastors that arrived from Alsace-Lorraine, as well as another called Émile Neumayer, who actually went off to study. His sister stayed on, but they kind of reinvigorated the church in Oradour during this time. Tragically, Émile Neumayer, there on the right-hand side, was back in Oradour on the 10th of June 1944, visiting his sister Odette. So unfortunately, both of those children, who were originally from Schiltigheim, were killed. This is l'Abbé Chapelle, who'd been Oradour's priest for many years, and was pretty fed up with the lack of people who were attending church before the refugees and evacuees arrived, when things went uphill again for the church. People tended to go for the weddings and the christenings and the high days and holidays, but he was upset that more people didn't go to regular sort of Sunday services. Just looking at this is sort of just the entrance of the church. You can see that the cross that remains there, along with a panel which was fixed there to ask visitors to think about what had happened there. You can see the collapsed roof of Les Halles overlooking the church, and the next photo is looking out from the church doorway back into that lower village. There is a tree just next to the church called, well, they called it the Liberty Tree, and it's an oak, and the reason they called it that was because it was planted on the birth of the Second Republic, when Jean-Baptiste Desorteaux became mayor for the first time. You can see it there in all its glory, still there apparently, with bottles of wine planted among its roots, and its shade has been provided cover to that part of the church sort of square and the Café Molière's for many years. One of the hardest places to visit in Oradour is obviously the church. It stands as an empty shell these days. You can see a plaque there to l'Abbé Chapelle, commemorating his service to the community of Oradour, and all the women and children under the age of 16 died in the church when they were shot at, and then asphyxiated, then shot at, and then burned. One woman survived, this woman, Marguerite Roufanche, who managed to escape out of the window just above the altar, that window in the middle there. I think it's the one in the middle. I don't think it could be the other one that's been suggested, which is the one on the right-hand side. She jumped down onto that banking, and you can see it's a bit of a drop. She was spotted and shot at, but managed to sort of crawl away and survive. When the horror started, a group of women and children managed to get into the sacristy at the back of the chapel, where they tried to hide, but the Germans, or I should say the SS, set fire to the section underneath, which is like a cellar, and then started firing through the door. So the floor, you can see where the floor was in the wall there, gave way, and Madame Roufanche watched as her daughters and grandson fell into the blaze below, along with lots of other innocent people. There's a pram just in front of the altar, the remains of a pram. That's the door to the sacristy that they managed to get through. Two young boys, I believe they were brothers, were found within this confessional box, on the one side, almost in a kind of embrace. They'd escaped the bullets, but they didn't escape the asphyxiating smoke, and they sort of fairly preserved bodies were found afterwards. A huge pile of bodies was found just next to this door. You can see it's a door out behind the church to where the presbytery is, but the soldiers had that covered and had locked the door, unfortunately, and the bodies piled up, unfortunately. You can see the remains of the bell, the church bell, which fell from the tower. It had melted, and it's still there. The church tower there, which collapsed on itself through the heat. Looking out from the church there to the sort of extreme eastern edge of the village, the Glane is just a little bit further on, the River Glane, and then there's the road, there's the bridge and the road that goes towards Limoges. That area in the corner there also has one of the execution places, the Bouchoul barn where some bodies were actually identified. It was in this part of the village that there were several events going on that day. There was a christening and in the Milord property. There was also this lady Gilberte Henri. Her name was actually, her maiden name was Biver. She had arrived in Oradour with her family as a refugee and had met one of the commanders at the GTE camp, a man called Jean Henri. They had gone to Paris to live and then had come back for the weekend with their 2-year-old daughter Michelle to see the family of Gilberte, who was still in Oradour. People came from all around to visit this really lovely little village. Arriving by tram, some people would buy their food in one of the épiceries, the grocery shops. This one in the lower village was owned by the Mercier family and run by the son René Mercier, pictured here on the left-hand side with Armand Senon. It was here that two brothers actually hid out and survived the massacre. One was hiding from forced work service, the other was an escaped prisoner of war. And they'd been hiding for some time and they managed to escape. But unfortunately, one girl called Madeleine Bonnet, who was an orphan and was working for the mother of René Mercier, unfortunately was shot actually within the shop, or just outside the shop. I think she must have got away from the roundup and went back, and unfortunately was killed on the premises. She was only 17 and had been abandoned at birth. Was what they called a pupille de la nation, and had found her way to this happy life in Oradour-sur-Glane. Just next door, there's the Hôtel Milord, which was a really renowned place to take lunch if you did come to Oradour for the day. You had to really book in advance. All this before the occupation, of course. Things changed during the occupation when the hotels were filled with refugee families. But they continued to operate to some extent, and many of the refugee families actually, spent their time at one of the hotels in Oradour, and Milor, pictured there in the front, Leon Milor really helped these families to survive what was a really difficult time for them. People continued to come to Oradour during the early summer of 1944. It was an escape from the horrors of the city, but also it was a place where you could still get stuff. You could get produce that were sold in these villages, but perhaps weren't sold in the city centres or even the bigger towns. People came on that tram. You can see the tram lines there running up towards the church. This is an old mill on the Glane. People used to come there and fish and swim and just enjoy the countryside. For the final part of this visit, we'll walk back up that cemetery road, past the Lodi barn, past the edge of the Champ de Foix, to the one place in Oradour that wasn't destroyed, which is the cemetery. And it's quite an affecting place to go. I think it's worth that little walk, and you can see a monument there, built, the tall monument built in honour of the dead, and there are some kind of coffins underneath in which there are bones and of people that were never identified. That's not necessarily the most affecting thing. I think it's the many graves, family graves, which have these pictures and information about the families that lost their lives that day. Nearby there's an underground section where originally many of the unidentified remains were going to be put, but is now used instead because of various political disagreements. Just bits and pieces, memorabilia of the village as it was. And these flowers were on the altar in the church for the Saint Vierge ceremonies, which were due to take place on the 11th of June. Quite a reminder of really what happened in Oradour. As you look through these items, it takes you back to who these ordinary people were. They were just people trying to live their lives. And there were all sorts of people in Oradour. There were people who followed Pétain, who still would have followed Pétain and been behind Pétain as a man as late as 1944, but primarily people who were just living their lives, bikes and sewing machines and ink pots, toys, money, wallets, tools used by barbers, things from the church, all sorts of items. Reminds us of Oradour as a place where normal human beings were living until that day on the 10th of June 1944.